It wasn't the shouting that got to me. It wasn't even the cold look in her eyes or the way she stood there with her arms crossed, waiting for me to respond. It was the tone. That detached, rehearsed tone. "I don't need you making decisions for me, Gideon. I'm not your property." She said it like she had been practicing it, like she had run the words through her mind 100 times before letting them spill out. And that's what stopped me in my tracks. Not the argument itself, not the usual back and forth of a tired couple, but the way she meant it. I should have been angry. Maybe I should have argued back, demanded to know what she really meant. Instead, I just stood there, staring at the woman I had spent the last 8 years of my life with, wondering when exactly she had stopped seeing me as her husband. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. This wasn't the Lenora I married. It all started weeks ago, no, maybe months ago. The signs had been there, but I had ignored them, too wrapped up in work, in routine, in the quiet belief that things were fine. Because that's what we tell ourselves, right? That things are just going through a rough patch, that it's stress, that it's life. But now, standing in our kitchen, hearing those words come out of her mouth with that practiced ease, I knew. This wasn't about the argument. This wasn't about whatever small thing had set her off tonight. This was something else. I didn't say anything. I didn't push. I just nodded, swallowed the lump in my throat, and stepped back. I watched her expression shift, like she had expected more of a fight, like she wanted one. That's when I knew for sure. That night I barely slept. Lenora was next to me, turned away, her breathing even, like she hadn't just thrown a grenade into our marriage. And I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last few months in my head. The late nights, the sudden privacy, the way she used to laugh at my jokes but now barely looked up from her phone when I spoke. It had been subtle at first. A work event she hadn't mentioned until the last minute. A new password on her phone. The way she started dressing up for errands, when before, she barely put on makeup unless we were going out together. And now, this argument, this line, this thing between us that I couldn't ignore anymore. I had been a fool, but not anymore. The next morning I watched her, really watched her. She moved around the kitchen like nothing had happened, pouring coffee, checking her phone, scrolling through something with the kind of distracted smirk she used to give me. I felt like a stranger in my own house. "Do you have plans today?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She glanced at me, just for a second. Work. That was it. No extra details. No attempt to smooth over the tension. Just one clipped word before she grabbed her coffee and disappeared into the other room. And I knew, really knew what I had to do. I needed the truth. Even if it destroyed me. I spent the rest of the morning in a fog. My body went through the motions. Showering, getting dressed, making coffee. But my mind was miles away, stuck on a single question. Who was she when I wasn't looking? Because I had to admit it now, I hadn't been looking. Not really. I had been too comfortable, too trusting. I had believed that the life we built together was solid, that our love was unshakable. But love doesn't make someone act like a stranger. I needed answers. For the first time in our marriage, I hesitated before heading to work. I lingered, pretending to check emails on my phone, pretending I wasn't hyper-aware of Lenora moving through the house. She was dressed better than usual. I noticed it instantly, heels, fitted slacks, a blouse I'd never seen before. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring. My stomach twisted. I had to force my voice to sound normal. "Big meeting today?" She barely looked up. Something like that. A year ago, she would have told me everything. Where she was going, who she was meeting, what project had her stressed. But now I was just an extra in the background of her life. I should have let it go. I should have played it cool. Instead, I said, "You're not wearing your ring." That got her attention. A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance? Guilt? It was gone before I could pin it down. She looked at her hand, then shrugged. Forgot to put it on. That was all. No apology. No scrambling to fix it. Just forgot to put it on. I watched as she grabbed her bag and keys, then left without another word. And that's when I knew. I'm going to follow her. I waited exactly 5 minutes. Just long enough for her to believe I was sticking to my usual schedule, that I had already left for work. Then I grabbed my coat and walked out the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't me. I wasn't the kind of guy who snooped, who stalked his own wife, who played detective in his own marriage. But I wasn't going to be played for a fool either. I got in my car and pulled onto the main road, my eyes scanning for her vehicle. It didn't take long to find her. I knew the way to her office. She should have turned left at the light. She turned right. I clenched my jaw and followed, keeping a few cars back, my fingers tight around the steering wheel. She wasn't going to work. 15 minutes later, she pulled into a parking lot outside a small cafe. Not the kind of place where corporate meetings happened. Not the kind of place where she should be at 10 in the morning on a workday. And she wasn't alone. A man was already waiting for her, standing by the entrance like he knew she was coming. I watched as she stepped out of the car, smoothed her blouse, and walked up to him with a smile. A real smile. One I hadn't seen in months. And then she hugged him. Something inside me shattered. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind racing. Who was he? How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or just the first time I caught her? I wanted to march inside, to demand answers, to throw my wedding ring at her feet and walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I took out my phone. I wasn't ready to confront her yet, but I was ready to get proof. I sat in my car, phone in hand, stomach in knots. The scene playing out in front of me felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life, someone else's betrayal. Lenora, my wife, was sitting across from another man at a cafe table, her body language relaxed, her smile easy. She laughed at something he said. I barely recognized her. A few months ago, that laugh was mine. I knew I couldn't just sit there. If I wanted the truth, I had to act. I opened the camera app on my phone and zoomed in. My hands weren't steady, but I managed to take a few pictures. Lenora smiling at him, their hands almost touching on the table. Nothing outright damning, but enough to make my blood boil. I wanted to believe it was innocent, maybe an old friend, a work colleague, but deep down I knew better. People don't hide friendships. People don't take off their wedding rings for business meetings. I watched as they leaned in, voices low, completely wrapped up in whatever world they had built behind my back. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to piece together the timeline of my own marriage unraveling. How long had she been doing this? Had I missed all the signs? Or worse, had I seen them and chosen to ignore them? I wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. After an hour, they finally stood up. I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse hammering. Was this it? Would they go their separate ways? Or was this just the beginning of something worse? They walked outside together. I could see her face now, more animated than I had seen in months. He said something and she reached out, playfully swatting his arm. And then she hugged him. Again. But this time it lasted longer. I forced myself to keep taking pictures, even as I felt sick doing it. This was my reality now, capturing evidence of my wife's betrayal like some private investigator in my own marriage. They finally pulled apart and she walked to her car. He watched her go, hands in his pockets, a smirk on his face. I needed to know who he was, so I followed him. His car was nothing special. A dark blue sedan, no stickers, nothing to identify him. But I had his plate number now. I snapped a photo of it just in case. He drove off casually, like a man with nothing to hide. And that made my blood boil even more. I tailed him for 15 minutes, trying to keep my distance. I had no plan. If he parked outside some office building, I'd tell myself I was overreacting. If he led me somewhere else, I'd have my answer. When he pulled into a residential neighborhood, my stomach dropped. He parked in front of a small house, stepped out of his car, and walked inside like he belonged there. No hesitation. No looking over his shoulder. My mind spun. Was this his home? Or theirs? Had Lenora been coming here? I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, debating whether to knock on the door. Demand answers. Get the confrontation over with. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. Through the window, just barely visible past the curtains. Lenora's sweater was hanging on the back of a chair. My wife had been here before, and suddenly, I knew. This wasn't new. This wasn't a moment of weakness, a single mistake. This was a second life, and I had no idea how long it had been happening. I stared at that sweater, my thoughts unraveling faster than I could control. It wasn't just any sweater. It was hers. I had seen her wear it a dozen times, usually on lazy Sundays or when she curled up on the couch with a book. And now it was hanging inside his house. How many times had she been here? How long had she been slipping away while I sat at home, thinking she was working late, running errands, or out with friends? My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. I could barely breathe. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. I forced myself to stay in the car, to think before I acted. A confrontation would get me nowhere. If I stormed up to the door now, demanding answers, she'd lie. She'd twist the truth, gaslight me, make me feel like I was crazy. I needed to be smarter than that. I grabbed my phone and opened a new tab. There were ways to find out who he was: reverse searches, property records, social media. If I could get his name, I could get the full picture. It didn't take long. The house was owned by a man named Victor Calloway. The name didn't ring a bell. He wasn't one of our friends. Not a coworker I'd ever heard about. Not a family friend. So who was he? I checked social media, my heart pounding. His profile was private, but I could see one thing: his relationship status. Single. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process it. Had she been playing me this whole time? Keeping me around while she built something new on the side? Or was this just an escape for her? Something thrilling? Something reckless? I needed to hear it from her. But not yet. I drove home in a daze, my mind a storm of questions. Every single thing about our relationship, about her, suddenly felt like a lie, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. That night I watched her. Really watched her. The way she moved through the house, casual, like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't spent her morning with another man. Laughing, touching his arm, stepping into his house like she belonged there. I had never felt so disconnected from someone in my life. She caught me staring at one point. What? I forced a shrug. Nothing. She narrowed her eyes, like she didn't believe me. Then, just as quickly, she looked away and went back to whatever was on her phone. She wasn't worried. She wasn't guilty, because in her mind, I was still blind. I barely slept that night. Lenora was curled up beside me, her breathing slow, peaceful. I could almost pretend nothing was wrong, that she wasn't sneaking off to see another man. But the pictures in my phone said otherwise. The proof was right there, sitting in my gallery, waiting for me to decide what to do next. And I still had no idea what my next move was. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after, I woke up before Lenora. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything I had uncovered pressing down on my chest. My wife was living a life I knew nothing about. The betrayal was real, tangible, undeniable. But the worst part? She had no idea that I knew. I turned my head and looked at her. She was still asleep, her hair a mess, her breathing soft and steady. She looked so normal, so at peace. It made me sick. I quietly got out of bed, walked to the bathroom, and locked the door behind me. I needed a moment, a second to gather myself before I lost control. I turned on the faucet, splashed cold water on my face, and gripped the edge of the sink. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed and exhausted. What was I supposed to do now? I had proof. I had seen her with him, seen the way she looked at him, seen her sweater in his house. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a bad decision she'd regret. This was deliberate. She had chosen this, chosen him, and yet, she was still coming home to me, sleeping in our bed, sitting across from me at dinner, acting like we were still husband and wife. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just cheating. She was lying to my face every single day. I left the house before she even woke up. I needed space, needed to clear my head before I did something reckless. I drove with no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to move. But no matter where I went, the thoughts followed. How long had this been going on? Was it serious? Did she love him? Or was she just using me? I pulled into a random parking lot, turned off the car, and stared at my phone. I had all the proof I needed. The pictures, the location, the name. But none of it answered the one question that mattered most. Why? I wanted to ask her. I wanted to demand the truth. But something in my gut told me she wouldn't give it to me. She'd lie. She'd spin some story, downplay it, maybe even try to turn it around on me. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the day in a haze. Work was impossible, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the same moments over and over. Her hand on his arm. Her smile. The way she forgot to put on her wedding ring. When I finally got home that evening, I was bracing myself for another normal night of pretending. But something was different. Lenora was already waiting for me in the living room. She was dressed in something casual, legs tucked beneath her on the couch. But there was an edge to her. A tension in her posture. She had been waiting. "Where were you today?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. She never asked about my day. Not lately. I played it cool. "Work." She tilted her head, studying me. "You didn't text." My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. Didn't realize I needed to. She smiled, but it was tight. "Just checking." And in that moment, I realized something. She was suspicious of me. I wasn't the only one hiding something. She had spent months lying to me, sneaking around, covering her tracks. But now she was the one second-guessing. Had I acted different? Had I given something away? I played dumb, kept the conversation short, and excused myself to shower. But inside I was reeling. For the first time, I wasn't just the victim of her betrayal. I was in control. She didn't know what I knew, and I planned to keep it that way. At least until I figured out exactly what she was hiding from me. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the secret pressing against my chest. Lenora was sleeping next to me, her back turned, unaware that I was fully awake, unaware that I was planning my next move. She had no idea that I knew, no idea that I had followed her, that I had seen the way she looked at him, the way she laughed, the way she let herself be with someone else. But tonight, when she asked why I hadn't texted, I caught something in her voice. Hesitation. She was worried. She wasn't the only one keeping secrets anymore. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something other than devastation. I felt control. The next morning I changed my routine. I left for work early, before she even woke up. I didn't kiss her goodbye. Didn't even say anything. If she was starting to suspect something, I wanted to feed that doubt. I wanted her to wonder if I was the one pulling away. Because if she was nervous, if she was afraid of being caught, she might make a mistake. And I was going to be there when she did. I spent the day doing something I never thought I'd do. I started digging. I pulled up our phone bill, something I had never bothered to check before. Took me 5 minutes to find it. A number, repeated over and over. Late at night, early in the morning, random gaps throughout the day. I copied it into my phone and stared at it, my stomach twisting. Was it him? I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button. What was I even going to say if he picked up? Then, before I could overthink it, I hit search. Took a few seconds, but a name popped up. Victor Calloway. I clenched my jaw. So it was him. I wasn't just being paranoid. This wasn't some casual work friend. This wasn't innocent. This was a full-blown, months-long affair. By the time I got home that night, my head was spinning. I needed more. I needed everything. So I did something I wasn't proud of. I went through her purse. I had never invaded her privacy before. Never once felt the need to. But now I didn't care about what was right or wrong. Because I already knew that she didn't. First I found nothing. Just makeup, keys, loose change. Then I found her work badge. Tucked behind it was a receipt. From a hotel. A hotel I had never been to. A hotel 2 miles from his house. Dated 2 weeks ago. My hands shook as I stared at it. There was no more doubt. No more excuses I could make. She was sleeping with him, and she thought I was still in the dark. I heard the front door open. Lenora walked in, setting her bag down, stretching like she had the easiest day in the world. I stuffed the receipt back into her purse and stepped into the hallway. She looked up and smiled. "Hey," she said, like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't sneaking around, like she wasn't lying to my face. I smiled back. "Hey," and just like that, the game began. She thought she was the only one keeping secrets. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I stood there, looking at Lenora, knowing everything, yet pretending I knew nothing. It was a strange feeling. Watching her move through the house, acting normal, completely unaware that I had just uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. She hummed to herself in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, probably texting him, while I stood a few feet away, forcing myself to stay calm. But inside, I was burning. I wanted to confront her, to throw the hotel receipt on the table and watch her scramble for an excuse, to ask her how long she had been lying to my face, betraying me in my own home. But I didn't, because I wasn't ready for it to be over. Not yet. Instead, I played my part. Over the next few days, I made subtle changes. I stopped asking where she was going, stopped texting her when she stayed out late, stopped waiting up for her. And she noticed. At first, she seemed relieved, like my distance made things easier for her. But then, something shifted. She started watching me. I could feel it. The way her eyes lingered when I walked past. The way she asked casual questions, testing my responses. She was starting to wonder. Had I figured it out? Was I onto her? And that's exactly what I wanted. One evening, I set my phone down on the counter. Screen unlocked, messages open, and left the room. It was a trap. I had deleted every text, cleared every search history, made sure there was nothing incriminating. But I wanted to see if she would take the bait. When I came back 5 minutes later, the screen had changed. She had looked, and that confirmed everything. She wasn't just lying to me. She was afraid. The next morning, I woke up to something strange. Lenora was already awake, dressed earlier than usual, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. She was staring at me when I walked in. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated. "Nothing. Just, you've been acting different." There it was. I shrugged, pretending not to care. "Have I?" Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "Yeah, you have." I walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, took my time before answering. "I've just been busy. Work's been stressful." A lie, but she couldn't tell. She just nodded, watching me like she was waiting for something, like she was trying to read me. It took everything in me not to smirk. That night, I checked her phone while she was in the shower. I didn't even have to guess the passcode. I had memorized it weeks ago, back when I first started suspecting her. And what I found confirmed my worst fears. A text from Victor. "Victor, you sure everything's okay? You seem distant." "Lenora, I don't know. I think Gideon suspects something." My heart pounded. She was worried, and I wasn't going to stop until she broke completely. The next day, I made my biggest move yet. I left work early and drove to the hotel. The same one from the receipt. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe just to stand there, to see the place where my marriage had fallen apart. To put myself in the same space where she had chosen to betray me. But as I walked through the lobby, my breath caught in my throat. Because there, across the room, checking in at the front desk, was Victor. Alone. I didn't hesitate. I walked right up to him. And when he turned around and saw me standing there, the color drained from his face. He knew exactly who I was. And that was when I really knew. This wasn't just a fling. This was something more. Something I was about to end. For good. Victor froze. For a long moment he didn't say a word. Neither did I. I just stared at him, letting the weight of everything settle in. This was the man my wife had chosen over me. The man she had been sneaking around with for who knows how long. And yet, standing there in front of me, he didn't look proud. He didn't look smug. He looked afraid. "Gideon," he started. I held up a hand. "Save it." I didn't want an explanation. I didn't want excuses. I just wanted to look him in the eye and see him for what he was. A man who had built something on lies. A man who thought he could take something from me and walk away unscathed. But he wasn't my real problem. Lenora was. I turned and walked out of the hotel without another word. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to fight for her. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to let her lose me. And that was going to be the worst punishment of all. That night, when I got home, she was already waiting for me. She had probably felt something shift. Maybe she had seen my name pop up on Victor's phone. Maybe she had sensed the way the power dynamic between us had changed. She looked at me carefully. "Where were you today?" I took a deep breath. And then, calmly, I said, "I know, Lenora." Her face went pale. "What?" "I know about you and Victor," I said, my voice steady. "I've known for a while." I watched the emotions flicker across her face. Denial, panic, anger, guilt. But before she could start spinning a lie, I pulled out my phone, opened the pictures I had taken, and set it on the table. Silence. She swallowed hard, glancing down at the images. "Gideon, I shook my head. "Don't." She closed her mouth. For the first time, she had nothing to say. And for the first time, I felt free. I had already packed my bags. I had already spoken to a lawyer. I had spent too long waiting, wondering, trying to make sense of her actions. But now I didn't need to understand. I just needed to leave. "I want a divorce," I said, firm and final. She flinched like I had slapped her. "Gideon, wait." "No." I met her eyes, and for the first time in months, I saw fear. Not of getting caught. Not of losing her secret. Fear of losing me. She realized too late that she had made the wrong choice. But I wasn't going to be her backup plan. "I deserve better," I said, grabbing my keys. "And I'm done pretending you do too." And with that, I walked out the door. It wasn't easy. Divorce never is. There were lawyers, papers to sign, logistics to figure out. Lenora tried to apologize, to explain, to ask if there was anything left to save. But I was already gone. And you know what? It was the best decision I ever made. Because months later, when I moved into my new place, when I finally felt like myself again, I realized something. Lenora had taken me for granted. She thought I would always be there. She thought she could betray me and that I would fight to keep her. But instead, I let her go. And in doing that, I won. I got my life back. And I never looked back.